Okay, so welcome to the third lecture in our consciousness and introspection summer school. This lecture is called Introspection and Transparency, and let me begin by just recapping. Sorry, I couldn't move my thing forward for some reason just then. Recapping what we did in Lecture 1 and Lecture 2. So in Lecture 1, as you remember, we set out in very general terms what introspection is and noted some of the theories of introspection that can be found in the contemporary scene. Introspection is that distinctive way that we come to know certain things about our own conscious states, and there are various theories of what that way could be: perceptual theories, inferential theories, acquaintance theories, rationalist theories, and so on. And then in Lecture 2, we looked at, really what is a sort of classic in this part of philosophy, namely Shoemaker's criticisms of inner sense theories. As we saw, Shoemaker divides inner sense theories effectively into two. There are what he calls object perception theories and what he calls broad perception theories. And the criticisms of those theories are different. In the case of the object perception theory, if it were true, there would have to be some object that you can become aware of and attend to, and moreover the object would have to have certain intrinsic properties that you can become aware of and attend to, just as when you look at an ordinary object of perception like a wallet or a coffee cup, that there's an object which you can become aware of and attend to. And the idea is that in introspection there's just no such object. If you just think through cases like knowing by introspection that you believe something, there just doesn't seem to be such an object. And even in cases where the most plausible cases, for example, when you have a pain in the knee, there does seem in a certain sense to be an object, namely a pain in the knee, that doesn't seem to generalize to many other cases, and in any case is perhaps a parochial feature of English rather than a general feature of introspective knowledge. So that was the problem with the object perceptual view. The broad perceptual view is a very different view. It's the view that says that there's a sort of empirical law-like connection between being in a conscious state and believing that you are. Shoemaker thinks of this kind of view as a kind of perceptual view because it satisfies two conditions, namely the causality condition and the independence condition on perception. And as we discussed, it's a bit unclear that the mere fact that you satisfy those conditions is sufficient to make the theory that you hold a perceptual theory. Alex Byrne points out that an inferential theory would also satisfy those conditions. But there are ways of perhaps developing the broad perceptual theory so that it is a genuine kind of perceptual theory, at any rate merits that description. Shoemaker's criticism of the broad perception theory is basically this famous self-blindness argument, which, as we said, is a sort of difficult argument, both in Shoemaker's discussion and also in Byrne's discussion. But as I said, there's a way of thinking about that argument that I think makes it seem rather plausible, namely that if the broad perception theory is true, then there's something that's possible that on the face of it doesn't seem to be possible. And that's why the broad perception theory is false. What's possible? Well, what's possible is that you can be in a conscious state, be completely rational, be concerned about whether you're in that conscious state, be able to formulate the belief that you're in that conscious state, and yet not believe that you're in that conscious state. And that would be a case of self-blindness. As we said last time, that way of thinking about introspection really assimilates being in pain to ordinary states like being in debt, where it's fairly clear that you can be in debt and not satisfy the conditions that Shoemaker is talking about and nevertheless fail to believe that you're in debt. Sorry, you can be in debt and satisfy the conditions that Shoemaker is talking about and nevertheless fail to believe that you're in debt. It just doesn't look like being in pain is analogous to that. And so that's really the problem with the broad perception model. Well, today I want to look at one of the most prominent problems about introspection that has emerged in the philosophy of mind since Shoemaker's papers. And these problems, as we'll see, more or less take for granted that Shoemaker is correct about the perceptual models that he talks about. And the problem is this problem that comes up in Dretske's paper, which I put on the handout, called "How do you know that you're not a zombie?" And as I say, it's interesting to note that Dretske assumes, he doesn't just implicitly assume, he explicitly assumes that Shoemaker is right about inner sense theories. I can't do better than Shoemaker, he says at one point. So the whole idea is that these problems are premised on Shoemaker's criticisms, or at least presuppose that those criticisms are correct. And as we'll see, that's an important point, because while we might be, it's interesting to note that we would be able to solve the problem that Dretske is talking about by adopting an inner sense theory. That option is sort of assumed to have been blocked off already. And that's in a certain sense what sets up the problem. We've got this problem about introspection, which could be solved if you held an inner sense theory. But since those inner sense theories are off the table, the problem assumes sort of greater urgency. Now, the problem that Dretske is talking about is often described as concerning transparency. And I think one thing to say is that this label, the word transparency, is a very confusing label in this context. And that's partly because there are a great many things that are called transparent and transparency in philosophy. In philosophy of language, of course, we have the distinction between transparent and opaque contexts. Well, that's not what's going on here, but there are other things as well that even in philosophy of mind are called transparency. So there's one notion that we'll look at next time that's associated with Gareth Evans, called the transparency of perception, or the transparency of belief. And what Evans is sometimes described as referring to is the idea that one question, a question about what you think or believe, is transparent to another question, namely, what is the case in a certain situation? Unclear even whether in Evans's case the word transparent is the appropriate one. And then there's another word that is sometimes used, and that's the word diaphanousness, which has the same connotations as transparent. And that was used famously by G.E. Moore in when he said, as I've put it here, when we try to introspect the sensation of blue, all we can see is the blue. The other element is as if it were diaphanous. Diaphanous means you can somehow see through it. And here again we have this idea that somehow a certain element of a sensation of blue, namely the sensation part, is it's sort of see-through, it's diaphanous, it's transparent. Moore seems to be saying that this is somehow an important point or an important issue, an important feature that we must bear in mind when we think about introspection. But there's a problem with all of this talk of transparency and diaphanousness. Not simply that it's used in multiple ways, but also that it's overtly visual. Obviously, the sensation of blue isn't diaphanous in any sense, and Moore doesn't in fact say it's diaphanous. He says it's as if it were diaphanous. But of course it isn't a perceptual thing at all. It's not that you can see it. And indeed, that's been, from our point of view, that's a very important point, because we're operating in a sort of situation in which perceptual models have been set aside. Of course, we can use perceptual language to characterize these things. As we've already said, you can use notions like introspection. Introspection has within it a kind of perceptual idea. But nevertheless, we're not taking that language terribly seriously. So when people talk about transparency or diaphanousness, you should be a bit worried about how we can exactly interpret these phrases in a context in which, genuine perceptual notions have been set aside. We're not to interpret our access to our own mental states as literally perceptual, even if we talk that way, and even if it's almost impossible not to talk that way. So what is it that is going on when people refer to transparency and diaphanousness in these sorts of contexts? Well, I think that the answer is that, at least as Dretske is talking, that the issues aren't so much perceptual in any literal sense, but are epistemic, that is, they have to do with knowledge and so forth. And in particular, I think the key epistemic notion that Dretske focuses on, or at least we can read Dretske as focusing on, is the notion of evidence. So it's not all of this perceptual language that is used in these accounts and used to generate problems about introspection here are really evidential or at least epistemological in character, not so much perceptual. So what then is the basic idea of the argument that Dretske gives us in this paper? Well, I think the basic idea is that can be put this way: when you come to know that you're in a psychological state by introspection, for example, when I come to know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection, according to Dretske, there's just nothing that can count as evidence for that piece of knowledge. There's just nothing that counts as evidence for the thing that I claim to know. I claim to know that I'm seeing a cat, and it may even be true that I know it by introspection, but the problem is that there's nothing that counts as evidence in this case for my knowing this. There's nothing that counts as evidence in support of this. And that's one part of the idea, and the other part of the idea is that if there's nothing that counts as evidence, then it can't be knowledge in the first place. So in a certain sense, the idea here is that there's a sort of incoherence at the heart of the notion of knowledge by introspection. That is, it's a kind of knowledge, which means it must be somehow based on evidence, but on the other hand, there's just nothing that counts as evidence for the thing that you know, in which case it can't be knowledge. So there's a kind of incoherence. And Dretske puts this point in the title of his paper by saying, how do you know that you're not a zombie? Now, as you know, the notion of a zombie can be understood in several ways. There's the sort of Hollywood zombie. That's not what he's talking about. It's not even a zombie in the technical sense in philosophy of mind. In philosophy of mind, a zombie is supposed to be, by definition, a creature that is physically exactly the same as me, but who lacks conscious experience. Dretske isn't concerned with zombies in that sense, and in fact it makes it makes the argument that he's talking about look much more controversial than it is, because it looks as if he's presupposing the coherence or possibility of zombies, which are, in the philosophy of mind, is a sort of technical, is a controversial issue. But that isn't really what he's asking when he asks this question. He's just asking, what is your evidence for the belief that you are in conscious states, that you have conscious states? To not be a zombie in the relevant sense just means to have conscious states. And the question, how do you know that you're not a zombie, that you have conscious states, means what is your evidence, effectively, for that claim? So let's see if we can formulate the argument from evidence, which we can call it. This is the argument that I think that Dretske is talking about in this paper, in more explicit terms, and that will allow us to formulate certain responses to the argument. Well, I think you can, and here's at least one way to formulate the argument. So it has three premises and a conclusion. First premise says, if I know that I'm seeing a cat, I have evidence for what I know. So we can just use the same example I used from lecture 1, that I'm seeing a cat, I know that I'm seeing a cat. And once again, let's think about a case in which there's no, philosophical funny business going on, no fake cats or anything, no hallucinogenic drugs. It's just an ordinary case in which I know that I'm seeing a cat. And premise 1 says, if I know that I'm seeing a cat, in that kind of situation, I have evidence for what I know. Premise 2 says, if I have evidence for what I know, then there must be a proposition which is such that, first, I'm aware of that proposition, and second, it supports or confirms what I know. I'm going to go and look through all of these premises, each individually. But let me just first state them. So that's what premise 2 says. Premise 3 says that, at least in cases distinctive of introspection, there is no such proposition. In other words, there's no proposition of the kind specified in premise 2. Premise 2 says there's a proposition which has certain properties, namely A and B. And premise 3 says, at least in cases distinctive of introspection, there's no such proposition. There's no proposition that has the properties set out in A and in premise 2. And then the conclusion is that in cases distinctive of introspection, I don't know that I'm seeing a cat. So, for example, in the case that we imagined in lecture 1, in that case I began by thinking that I know that I'm seeing a cat, and then this piece of reasoning, if it's right, would tell me that I don't know that we've run into a kind of contradiction. I both know and I don't know. Okay, so that's the argument that I think that Dretske is setting out in his paper. Let's go through the premises of the argument and see what might support those premises. So the first premise says, if I know that I'm seeing a cat, then I have evidence for what I know. And this just seems to be an instance of an incredibly plausible epistemological premise. Roughly speaking, if you know things, you've got to have evidence for what you know. That just seems like sort of more or less undeniable. When people talk about, evidence-based medicine, for example, they mean, well, you must believe things on the basis of evidence. You can't believe things not on the basis of evidence. That would be sort of irrational. So here we've just got an application of this general principle to the case in which I'm seeing a cat. I know it. It must be the case that I have evidence for what I know. Now, we're going to have reason later to ask if this is always true, or in what sense it's always true. So I don't mean to say that it's, one can't possibly deny it. There's lots of questions to ask about it, but generally speaking, the connection between knowing something and having evidence seems, in a certain sense, undeniable, and that gives us a reason to believe premise 1. What about premise 2? Well, premise 2 says, if I have evidence for what I know, there's a proposition which is such that A, I'm aware of that proposition, and B, the proposition supports or confirms what I know. And this premise is sort of presupposes a certain conception of evidence, sometimes called a propositionalist conception or a premise conception of evidence. And it's you can motivate this conception of evidence just by thinking of simple examples. So let's take the example I mentioned in lecture 1. Suppose I know something, for example, that my neighbour is an accountant. I learn that my neighbour is an accountant, and suppose you ask me, well, how do you know that your neighbour is an accountant? Well, what you're sort of fishing around for there is some other proposition, typically another proposition that I know, which somehow confirms or supports the claim that my neighbour is an accountant. So if I say, for example, well, he dances in a certain way at the Christmas party, and only accountants dance that way, well, those are further propositions which I am aware of, and I'm aware of those propositions at least in the sense that I know or believe those propositions, perhaps because of perception, and those propositions confirm or support the claim that he's an accountant. So this is a case in which what evidence seems to be, in a certain sense, is propositions that I'm aware of which support what I know. And at least in the neighbour and accountant example, that seems like a reasonable thing to say. And when people often talk about, you must have evidence for what you say, etc., they usually mean some notion of evidence that's in force in premise 2. Okay, that's premise 2. Premise 3, in cases distinctive of introspection, there's no such thing. There's no such proposition. There's no proposition that I'm aware of which confirms or supports what I know. Well, why do I believe that? Well, suppose again I'm seeing a cat. Well, this seems to enable, when I see a cat, I certainly seem to come to know or be aware of certain propositions. Most of them have to do with the cat. So they include, for example, that there is a cat. I come to know that there is a cat when I see a cat. That seems undeniable. Perhaps I also can know certain other things about the cat. For example, its colour, that it's brown. Or perhaps that I know that it's a Burmese. Okay, so I can know all these propositions about the thing that I see, namely the cat, that it exists, that it's Burmese, that it's brown. But none of these things that I know about the cat seem to entail or confirm that I'm seeing a cat. That I'm seeing a cat is the proposition that we're interested in. And the things that I come to learn when I look at the cat don't seem to entail or confirm the proposition that I'm seeing a cat. Let's establish first of all that they don't entail that I'm seeing a cat. Well, take the things that I come to know when I'm looking at a cat, that there is a cat, that it's Burmese, that it's brown. That category of thing, that category of proposition can all be true even if I'm not seeing a cat. So therefore they don't entail that I'm seeing a cat. One way to show that is to just imagine a case in which I'm seeing a cat and I shut my eyes. I shut my eyes and I'm no longer seeing a cat. It's still the case that there is a cat, it is Burmese, it is brown, and so forth. So none of those facts by themselves tell me that I'm seeing a cat. So they don't entail that I'm seeing a cat, but perhaps they confirm it. Perhaps they confirm that I'm seeing a cat, but even that doesn't seem very plausible. I mean, if you told me suppose you're describing a certain possible situation, and you tell me that in this situation the following things are true. There's a cat, it's Burmese, it's brown, and so on. that doesn't seem in any way to support the hypothesis that I'm seeing a cat. It doesn't seem to make it more likely that I'm seeing a cat in the situation that you're describing. None of these things seem to have any bearing at all on the hypothesis that I'm seeing a cat. They just seem to be of a different sort of order. So in general, we might say that what I know through perception doesn't give me any evidence that I am perceiving anything. What I know through perceiving a cat doesn't give me evidence that I am perceiving a cat. What I know through perception might give me evidence about the cat, but it doesn't give me any evidence that I am perceiving a cat. That I am perceiving a cat seems to be a proposition unrelated to the things that I come to know through perception. So perception itself doesn't seem to provide me any evidence for the claim that I'm seeing a cat. Not in the sense of premise 2. There's nothing I'm aware of which supports or confirms what I know, namely that I'm seeing a cat. And nor is there any other belief that I have from which I might infer that I'm perceiving a cat. Remember from lecture 1 we talked about cases in which I might come to know things about my behaviour or about my circumstances, for example, in which I could infer that I'm seeing a cat, just as I might infer in the case of a third party, somebody else, like Taylor Swift. Let's say that she is seeing a cat. I can know that by observing her behaviour and her surroundings, and then infer that she's seeing a cat. I might, in certain cases, do that in my own case, just as much as I can for her. But it's easy to imagine a case in which that isn't true, in a case in which I'm just looking at a cat. I haven't seen myself in the mirror. I'm just looking at a cat. And the problem is that if that's what's going on, then nothing that I'm aware of seems to be a proposition which supports or confirms the hypothesis that I'm seeing a cat. So premise 3 seems to be true. In cases distinctive of introspection, there is just no such proposition. Again, no such proposition means no proposition that meets the conditions laid down in, just going back, meets the conditions laid down in premise 2, that you're aware of that proposition, or that there's a proposition such that you are aware of it and that it supports or confirms what you know. So these 3 premises lead to our conclusion: in cases of distinctive of introspection, I don't know that I'm seeing a cat. Now, this doesn't entail that I don't know at all that I'm seeing a cat. Maybe, for example, in certain cases, I would have perceptual or inferential evidence that I'm seeing a cat. And so there's a sense in which you could perhaps agree with this conclusion. In effect, what this conclusion would show is that there isn't any such thing as knowledge by introspection. Dretske himself, I think, comes very close to endorsing this view. We might think of this as a kind of disappearance theory of introspection. I've been thinking of introspection right from the beginning as that distinctive way that we come to know certain things, that we're seeing a cat or something like that. And I've been presupposing that there is such a way, and what we need to do is to provide information about it. But of course there's a possibility here, which would be the possibility I'm describing as the disappearance theory, which would say, well, there is no such thing. There's no such thing as that way. There isn't any such distinctive way. That's what we learn from going through this, and perhaps that's what the argument shows. That, I think, would be a pretty radical solution. I'm not really going to discuss that solution in this course too much, but it's important to note that it's there, and it's also important to note that someone like Dretske, I think, ended up with a solution rather like that. He thought that the idea that there is this distinctive way must be a kind of an illusion. There can't be such a thing. And the reason is because of the premises we were just looking at. But I think as I say at the bottom of this slide, I think it would be completely remarkable if that were never true. It would be odd if, it would be kind of remarkable if in the example I began with, it just wasn't true that I could come to know that I'm seeing a cat in this distinctive way, especially given that the distinctive way is supposed to be understood in, in such a way that we don't know very much about it. I mean, we haven't said very much about that distinctive way at all. So it would be very strange to think that, that the conclusion of this argument is true. So I think in a certain sense the argument presents us with a sort of paradox. If we go back to just looking at it, here it is again, the argument from evidence. The premises seem to give us the conclusion, but the conclusion seems sort of unbelievable, which isn't to say that some people believe it. Namely, even the proponent of the argument, Dretske, believes it. But I think we should resist the conclusion, in which case we need to find a way to resist the premises, or perhaps resist the transition from the premises to the conclusion. Well, how then are we going to move forward? If we've agreed that the conclusion is no good, what are we going to say about the premises? Well, I want to begin by looking at something that Alex Byrne emphasizes in his discussion of this argument. So Byrne has a very good discussion of this argument in his book, but also in the paper that I asked you to look at. He sets out this argument, not exactly not precisely in the way that I've just done, but in a way that's obviously close to this. And one of the observations he makes about the argument is that it's analogous, in a certain sense, to a much better known argument, which he thinks of as a kind of skepticism about the external world. And he thinks that this, in fact, what Byrne has this sort of striking phrase for the evidence argument, as I've been calling it, which is that he thinks of it as skepticism about the internal world, not skepticism about the external world. But the crucial point that I want to focus on is that Byrne says that in the paper that I asked you to look at, he says that the external world argument, the argument that's analogous to Dretske's argument, has as he calls it, a glaring flaw. It has a glaring flaw, and so it would be useful then to examine this glaring flaw and turn then back to the evidence argument. I should say that Byrne doesn't, of course, think that the glaring flaw in this analogous argument, the argument about the external world, is likewise a flaw in the argument about the internal world. On the contrary, he thinks that the argument about the internal world motivates a sort of complicated inferential view about introspection. But nevertheless, it would be interesting to see why exactly this analogous argument fails, and why exactly the failure of this analogous argument is not a failure in Dretske's argument. So that's what I want to look at now. So here's the analogous argument, I think, that's exactly like Dretske's argument. The only difference is that here we're not talking about knowing something by introspection, but rather knowing something by perception. So I can know by introspection, for example, that I'm seeing a cat, but presumably I can know by introspection that there is a cat. Okay, I can know by introspection that there is a cat, even regardless of whether I can know by introspection that I'm seeing a cat. But then we could imagine an argument a bit like Dretske's, which is targeted on this idea of knowledge by perception. And it's got nothing to do with the issue of knowledge by introspection. And here's how the argument would go. If I know that there is a cat, I must have evidence for what I know. Again, that seems like an instance of an undeniable epistemological premise. Second, if I have evidence for what I know, there is a proposition which is such that I'm aware of that proposition, or B, it supports or confirms what I know. that again is just an application of a particular notion of evidence that is in operation in Dretske's argument, and if it's okay for it to be in operation in Dretske's argument, it's okay for it to be in operation here. The third premise is exactly the same as the Dretske, the premise, the counterpart premise in Dretske's argument, except that we're thinking of cases distinctive of perception. In cases distinctive of perception, there's no such proposition. There's no proposition which is such that I'm aware of that proposition and it supports or confirms what I know. And then the conclusion is that in cases distinctive of perception, I don't know that there's a cat. So what that means is there isn't such a thing as knowledge by perception. I can't come to know by perception that there is a cat. So I can't come to know pretty much anything by perception. Well, what can we say about this analogous argument? Well, what Byrne says, as I mentioned, is that there's a glaring flaw in this argument. And the glaring flaw can be put like this, that premise 1, the first premise, is false. Let's go back again. The first premise says, if I know that there is a cat, I have evidence for what I know. So now we're imagining a perceptual case in which I know by perception that there's a cat. And the question is whether I must have evidence for what I know. Well, the glaring flaw is that that isn't true. It's not true that if I know that there's a cat, I must have evidence for what I know, because one might say that I can come to know that there's a cat by perceiving the cat. And to perceive a cat is to be object aware, and this is object awareness in the sense that Shoemaker was talking about last time we looked at this notion of object awareness as one of the constitutive features of perception according to many people. So I can perceive a cat is to perceive a cat, is to be object aware of a cat. But to be object aware of a cat is not to have evidence in the sense of P2 of the second premise of the argument, P2 star. So I can be object aware of a cat, that means I can perceive a cat, and it's not the case that there is some proposition that I'm aware of which supports or confirms the claim that there's a cat. I just come to know that there's a cat because I perceive the cat, not because I'm aware of some proposition that supports or confirms what I know. Byrne points out that this must be true in for animals, for example, who presumably can come to know that there are cats. Dogs, for example, can come to know that there are cats by perceiving cats, not because they, or at least not necessarily because there's some proposition which they're aware of which supports or confirms what they know. They have no premise from which they infer that there's a cat. It's just simply that they come to know that there's a cat by perceiving cats. So the idea is that you can be object aware of a cat without having evidence in the sense of P2. Now, this way of dealing with this analogous argument, namely by denying the first premise that it has a glaring flaw, as Byrne says, you might ask, what happened to the motivation for premise 1? The motivation for premise 1, going back again, premise 1 says, if I know that there is a cat, I have evidence for what I know. The motivation for that is just simply, well, you've got to have evidence for what you know. Evidence is, it's sort of undeniable on the face of it. And when you know things, you've got evidence for what you know. Now we're in the business of denying that, because we're saying sometimes you can know things even if you don't have evidence. Well, the thing is that the general principle that supported premise 1 is false if by evidence you mean evidence in the sense that's at issue in premise 2. Premise 2 gives us a specific notion of evidence, a sort of propositional notion of evidence, and we can certainly use the word evidence in that way, and that captures a lot of what we mean when we talk about evidence. But we might also think of evidence in a more general way if we wanted to, namely evidence is just something that makes it rational for you to believe certain things. And in that sense, it might also be the case that you can't know things without evidence. But that's not evidence in the sense of premise 2. So the idea is that we can deny the motivation for premise 1 if that means evidence in the sense of premise 2. Examples like coming to know that there is a cat on the basis of perceiving a cat seem to be cases in which we don't have evidence for what we know, at least if by evidence you mean premise, the kind of thing that is happening in premise 2. We could have a more expansive notion of evidence according to which even that would count. Even this case of being object aware of a cat would count as evidence. But that would be a rather different and more expansive notion of evidence. Okay, so we have at least a response to the argument, the analogous argument in the perceptual case, namely that the first premise of the argument is true. Okay, so can we argue similarly that premise 1 of the Dretscke argument is false? We've just noted that the Dretscke argument is analogous. Following Byrne, we've noticed that the Dretscke argument is analogous to the perceptual, to an argument about perception. And in the case of that argument about perception, we can reject the argument because its first premise is false. Okay, question, can we do the same for the Dretscke argument? So the first premise of that argument is, if I know that I'm seeing a cat, I have evidence for what I know. So here we're not talking anymore about knowing that there is a cat, but knowing that I'm seeing a cat. Can we reject that? Well, to say precisely the same thing would be to say, I can come to know that I'm seeing a cat by perceiving, let's say, and so be object aware of some mental item, perhaps the state of affairs that consists of my seeing a cat, or perhaps an event, let's say, of my seeing a cat, something like that. Now, if you said that, then that would be to hold precisely the object perception model of introspection. That's exactly what the object perception model says. It says that introspection is to be understood on the model of perception where perception involves object awareness. And if Shoemaker is right, that entire picture has been ruled out. That picture is completely off the table. So in other words, the glaring flaw that Byrne points out in the analogous argument, namely that the first premise is false because you can basically know that there are cats on the basis of seeing cats and not on the basis of having evidence in the sense of premise 2, that move is just not available to us in the case of Dretske's argument, because if we made that move, then we would have backed ourselves into an inner sense theory without noticing, an object perception model of introspection. But Shoemaker has blocked that off, or at least so we're assuming, and so Dretsche assumes. And so we can't deal with this argument in that kind of way. Now you might ask, well, what about the other perception model that Shoemaker is talking about, the broad perception model? Maybe we could appeal to the broad perception model to deal with this argument, and we could argue, for example, that premise 1 is false, not because you have evidence in the sense of premise 2 for what you know, for the belief that that you're seeing a cat, but perhaps just because there's a law-like connection between consciously seeing cats on the one hand and believing that you're seeing a cat on the other hand. And in that case, you might, because that law is in force, you'd come to believe that you're seeing a cat even though you have no evidence. Well, that too, that's right, that would enable us again to reject premise 1, at least in a certain sense of evidence, the one that's at issue in premise 2. And so again, we'd have a response to the argument that takes the same form as this glaring flaw that Byrne points out in the analogous argument. But once again, Shoemaker has blocked that. Once again, if we accept the self-blindness argument against the broad perceptual model, then we can't, in fact, respond to Dretske's argument in this way. So again, it's true that, were the, in a sense, view available, we would have this response to Dretske's argument that is analogous to the glaring flaw that Byrne points out, but we don't have those views available to us. So where are we? Well, I think what we've seen so far is, in a sense, you can begin to see why this evidence argument has achieved such prominence in philosophy of mind post Shoemaker's discussion of the inner sense view. And that's because there's an argument, Shoemaker's argument, as Byrne says, is analogous. Dretske's argument, take it back. Dretske's argument is analogous, as Byrne says, to this classical argument about the external world. That's why Byrne calls it skepticism about the internal world. And if you look at these arguments side by side, it's relatively clear how to respond to the external world argument. That's the glaring flaw that Byrne points out. But the thing is that we've got no analogous move. There's no analogous move that we can make in the case of the Dretske argument. And that's, in a certain sense, exactly why the argument has become so prominent. It's once we've ruled out these perceptual models on the basis of Shoemaker's arguments, then there's just this big problem about how we can even understand the notion of evidence, how we can come to know anything on the basis of introspection, which we don't have in the case of perception, mainly because, of course, in perception, we have a perceptual model of perception. Okay, so that's sort of where we are. And I think the next step is to see if we can look back at some of the other theories I set out for you in Lecture 1. I mean, I set out those theories very quickly, actually, but now we can look more slowly at them. Anyway, the idea would be to see whether those other theories help us in the sense that we can help us by give us options of dealing with this argument in a way that's somehow analogous to the perceptual model, but without falling into the trap of being a perceptual model in Shoemaker's way. And so that's what I want to look at next. And in particular, I want to look at one of those theories, the rationalist theory, which is the one that I'm personally am most attracted to. So what I'm going to do in the next little while is to go through, in much more slowly than I did in Lecture 1, go through what this view amounts to and how it would respond to this evidence argument. So what then is the rationalist view? Well, the rationalist view begins with this idea about rationality. It says, forget for a minute about introspection and just think about rationality. Rationality is a matter of there being certain combinations of mental states which your idealized rational self, the ideally rational agent, would be in. And you are in to the extent that you conform to this ideal. Or to put it another way, there are certain combinations of mental states that you're rationally permitted or rationally required to be in, and the principles of rationality presumably constrain what those combinations of mental states are. So here's some rough examples, and these are very sort of standard examples of what principles of rationality look like. So the first one says, I'll call them R1, R2, and so forth. The first one, R1, says, well, if you believe that P, then other things being equal, do not believe that not P. So the idea here is that a rational agent is a person who doesn't have contradictory beliefs. The ellipsis, the ... is there to remind us that any of these principles are extremely complicated. It might be in certain cases rational to hold contradictory beliefs, for example, but the idea is that you shouldn't hold contradictory beliefs when the contradiction is too obvious, or when you exploit that contradiction in your reasoning, or something of the sort. So that's true for any of these principles of rationality, namely that they're subject to certain kinds of background conditions, perhaps certain kinds of exceptions, and so forth. Another one might be, so R1 is a kind of non-contradiction rule. R2 is a kind of means-end rule. So if you intend to do something and you believe that you can only do that thing by doing this other thing, then you will intend to do this other thing. So, if I intend to, make an omelette, and I believe that I can only make an omelette by breaking eggs, then I will intend to break eggs. So notice in both of these cases, R1 and R2, what we have is the idea that rationality puts constraints on what kind of combinations of mental states, in this case, beliefs. In the first case, it's just beliefs, what beliefs you can have in combination and not have in combination. And in the second example, likewise, it's what states of intention and belief typically go together. And the idea is, in the second case, if you intend and believe certain things, then you'll intend and intend other things. R3 is a different kind of one. It says a different kind of principle. It says something like, suppose you intend to do something, then you'll believe that you will. A rational agent will believe that you will, at least in certain circumstances. So, for example, suppose I intend to have dinner this evening, which I can assure you I do. Suppose I intend to have dinner this evening, then I will believe that I will have dinner. And this is a case in which my belief that I will have dinner is a belief that goes together rationally with intending to do something. It's not just a straightforward prediction about what will happen in the future. It's a belief that I would be in as a matter of following this rule, that if I intend to do something, then I believe that I will. And then there are other rules which are somewhat more familiar in the philosophy of mind case. One of them is one that comes up a lot in discussions of conceivability arguments and so forth in the mind-body kind of issue. It's that if you imagine that P, then you'll believe not that P is true, but that P is possible. So if I imagine that there is, for example, a mile-high unicycle, to take a Chalmers example, then I'll believe that it's possible that there is such a thing, if I abide by this rule. And another one might be a rule about how perception and belief come together. So if I perceive something, I perceive that there's a cat, then perhaps it's rational in certain circumstances for me to believe that there's a cat. These are all, again, mental states. What I want you to see is that these are all requirements or rules about what sorts of mental states what sorts of combinations of mental states are appropriate in a rational agent. What combinations of belief, what combinations of intention and belief, what combinations of imagination and belief, perception and belief, and so forth. Okay, so the rationalist view that I want to talk about, the rationalist view of introspection, takes this picture of rationality for granted. It's not completely uncritical about it. It might be that it needs to be revised or developed in certain ways, but it more or less takes this for granted in the background. And then what it suggests is that we could think of another rule of rationality that isn't so much about imagination or perception, isn't so much about intention or belief, but it's about consciousness. It's about what happens in a rational agent when they are in a conscious state. And we can formulate this rule. We can call it R6 because we've gone through R1 through 5 so far, but we could also call it an introspection rule, if you like. And it says that if you're in a conscious state, then ... believe that you're in it. That's what the rule requires of you. And once again, the ellipsis here is in place to tell us that there must be lots of background conditions, there may be some exceptions and so forth, but the idea is that just as, for example, a rational agent shouldn't have contradictory beliefs, or should engage in means-end reasoning, or should believe what they perceive, likewise a rational agent should, if they're in a conscious state, believe that they're in a conscious state, at least in certain circumstances. So, for example, what it would require you to do is to believe that you're in the state of seeing a cat. If you're in the conscious state of seeing a cat, if you're in that state, then you should believe that you're in that state, so long as certain background conditions are met. What background conditions? Well, one is that you must be psychologically capable of believing that you're in that state, or that it matters to you, for example, that you're in that state. And perhaps also that you have no countervailing evidence. It's not like somebody has just informed you, somebody you trust has just informed you that you're not in that state. So the idea is that there's a rational requirement here that's analogous to requirements in other cases that we accept as part of a certain plausible picture of rationality. So that's the basic proposal of the rationalist view. Now, what does that mean for belief and knowledge about a conscious state? Well, suppose that you abide by this rule. Suppose that you are rational to the extent that you abide by the rule. I should perhaps go back here and say that in the picture of rationality that I'm assuming, where we've got these rules like R1, R2, and so forth, what is it for a person to be rational? If these are the rules of rationality, it's for a person to abide by those rules. To abide by those rules. So it's a bit like saying, well, there's the laws of the road, stop at a stop sign, stay on a particular side of the road, and so forth, give way in certain circumstances. And a person who is a legal driver who obeys the law is someone who would, is a person who is a good driver in that sense is a person who obeys those principles or abides by them. And likewise, a person who is rational is a person who abides by these rules. That's what it is to be rational according to this sort of picture. You can of course be rational to a greater or lesser extent. You can abide completely or fully to these rules. You can abide only sometimes, and so forth. But the general idea is that to be rational is a matter of abiding by these rules. So if we have a rule like R6, for example, which is an extension of this, then to abide by that rule would be part and parcel of being a rational agent. Now suppose that you are such an agent and you abide by this rule, and suppose that you are in a conscious state, so that you abide by the rule R6. Then R6, remember, says, if you're in a conscious state, then believe that you are, at least in certain circumstances. Suppose you abide by that rule, and suppose that you're in a conscious state, then you will immediately have a certain kind of disposition to believe that you're in that conscious state, given certain background conditions. Again, let's look again at that R6. It says, suppose if you're in a conscious state, believe that you're in it. Well, suppose I abide by this rule. That means that I can form my mental states to that rule. Okay, and now suppose I abide by the rule and I'm also in a conscious state, the one mentioned in the antecedent here. Then I will at least have a disposition to form the belief mentioned in the consequent of the rule, given the relevant background conditions are met. The background conditions are the ones that need to be in place in order for me to believe that I'm in that conscious state. So then I will have a certain disposition to believe that I'm in a conscious state, given the background conditions. And the belief that I'm disposed to form, that is, remember I have a rational disposition to believe this, the belief that I'm disposed to form would be a justified belief in several different ways. In the first case, it would be justified in the sense that it's the outcome of a rational process. It's a process that I will go through as a matter of being a rational agent, and it would be the manifestation of a disposition that I have in virtue of being a rational agent. So it's the outcome of a rational process, And likewise, and connected with this, in fact, the belief would be reliably true. If I form the belief that I'm in a conscious state, because I abide by a certain rule and I'm in that state, then the belief that I form will be true, at least reliably true. So it's going to be a justified belief in that sense. And moreover, if I do form the belief, it would in the normal case amount to knowledge. Why would it amount to knowledge? Well, it's going to be a true belief. It's going to be a justified belief because it's the outcome of a rational process. And actually it would normally meet the other conditions of knowledge like safety and so forth. I won't go into those aspects of the issue here, but the general idea is that we can assume that at least in the normal case a belief of that kind would amount to knowledge. Okay, so let's go back to the argument. What I've just been doing is giving you a kind of some background ideas about this rationalist view, namely that we can think of rationality as a matter of abiding by certain rules. If we extend that picture by saying that among the rules is an introspection rule, then what we can do is that when we can say that if you're in a conscious state, you have a certain disposition to form a belief that you're in that state in virtue of abiding by the rules, and that the belief in question will be a justified belief and will, in the normal case, amount to knowledge. Okay, so now let's apply those ideas to the argument. Well, the argument says, if I know that I'm seeing a cat, I have evidence for what I know. If I have evidence for what I know, then there is a proposition which meets certain conditions, and in cases distinctive of introspection, there is no such proposition of that kind. Well, what the rationalist view does is it allows us, and in fact gives us good reason, to reject the first premise. So if I consciously see a cat, for example, and if I abide by the rule, then I can reasonably and knowledgeably come to believe that I'm seeing a cat. And yet I don't have any evidence for this belief in the sense that P2 requires. Okay, so in a certain sense the issue is, the response is logically like the perceptual view. Like the perceptual view, it denies premise one of the argument. It says, just as Byrne said that there was a glaring flaw in this analogous argument, likewise the rationalist view allows us to say that the first premise of the argument is wrong. It's not the case that I have evidence in the sense of P2 for the claim that I'm seeing a cat. It's rather that I can form a justified belief that I'm seeing a cat because I abide by this rule, and I am, in fact, seeing a cat. So I can deny premise one. Now, at this point, I think it's important to see that the rationalist view that I've been describing, that allows us to respond to this argument in the same way that the perceptual model does, can also respond to a slightly more general version of this argument. We noted above that when we started thinking about Dretske's argument, I said it's extremely puzzling that this argument uses visual language like transparency, or that presentations of this argument typically use that, since, we should be hypercritical of that sort of language, especially in the context in which we've set aside the perceptual model. And the answer is that, and the best way forward is to think about Dretske's argument as formulated in epistemological terms rather than in perceptual terms. So far I've been focusing on particular epistemological terms, namely knowledge and evidence, and also reasonable or justified belief. But it's worth noting that the argument from evidence can be formulated using a slightly different notion, a slightly less well-known notion, and this is what is sometimes called propositional justification. The contrast is propositional justification is usually contrasted with doxastic justification, which means the notion of a justified or reasonable belief. That's the one that I've been talking about so far. To be propositionally justified in believing a proposition means really to be in a position to hold a justified belief. regardless of whether you do hold it. Sometimes you can be in a situation in which you're in a position to hold a justified belief, but you don't actually hold the belief. If you don't actually hold the belief, you can't have a belief. There isn't a belief to be justified, but we might want to say that in general you can still be in a certain kind of epistemological position, namely to hold a justified belief even if you don't hold it. Well, we can formulate the Dretske argument using this notion as well. If I have propositional justification for the belief that I'm seeing a cat, I have evidence for that belief. If I have evidence for that belief, then there has to be a proposition which meets conditions A and B. And again, in cases distinctive of introspection, there's no such proposition. And so again, we get the conclusion that in cases distinctive of introspection, I do not have propositional justification for the belief that I'm seeing a cat. The reason for thinking about the argument in this version is that you might be interested in a kind of slight variation on the case that I started with. In the case that I started with, I said, look, take a case in which you're seeing a cat. Let's assume that you know that you're seeing a cat. But we could have a situation in which you are seeing a cat, but you just haven't formed the belief for whatever reason that you're seeing a cat and therefore don't know it. Could we have a version of the argument that applied even then? And we can if we use the notion of propositional justification. Because in that case you might say, well, even if you haven't formed the belief that you're seeing a cat, given that you're consciously seeing a cat, you're entitled to form that belief. That is, you're in a position to form that belief, that justified belief, and that would be a matter of having propositional justification. But the Dretske argument could be used to undermine that too, just by going through this slightly different version of the argument as well. Well, the thing is that the rationalist view that I've been describing, the rationalist account, permits us to reject the first premise of this version of the argument as well. This version of the argument that uses the notion of propositional justification and not the notion of knowledge. Because on this view, suppose again that you consciously see a cat and you abide by the rule, it doesn't follow from the fact that you abide by the rule that you will believe this, because the rule has a lot of background conditions in it. In that situation, that's why when that you have to be capable of forming the belief, you have to be interested in whether the belief is true, you have to have no countervailing evidence and so forth. But the idea, so that you could in fact abide by the rule and not form the belief. But if you did that, then you would be in a position, if you consciously saw the cat and you abided by the rule, then you'd be in a position to form a justified belief, regardless of whether you do. And as before, you'd have no evidence in the sense required for the belief in question. So the idea here is that even in a case in which you see a cat and you do so consciously, but you don't form a belief that you do, you're in a position to form that justified belief because you're disposed to form a belief which would be justified if you did form it. And that's why you're propositionally justified to form a belief that you consciously see a cat, even if you have no evidence in the sense required in the rest of the argument. Okay, so that's the rationalist sort of view about this argument, that we can respond to the Dretske type of argument by rejecting the first premise. In the knowledge version, you can know perfectly well that you see a cat without having evidence in the sense that is required in the rest of the argument. And likewise, you can even be propositionally justified in believing that you're seeing a cat without having evidence. Okay, so there are some questions about this rationalist view. One, let me think, there are really three kinds of questions that we might ask. One is a sort of, you might think of as a formulation question, which is, well, what exactly should be the proper form of this introspective rule? I haven't said anything about it. I've only said that it takes the form that if you're in a conscious state, then ... believe that you are. But what exactly is the form of that requirement? A second question, which we might call the explanation question, asks, well, why is that requirement a requirement of rationality in the first place? You might say, well, everything you've said so far is highly conditional. It's conditional on there being this requirement. But why should we accept that there is this requirement? And then the third question, which we might think of as a comparison question, is, well, how does this approach compare with other approaches to introspection? And in particular, in this specific context, how does it compare with other ways of dealing with the evidence argument? Well, I'm not going to be able to answer all of these questions today, or even in this course, but what I'm going to do is to make some fairly brief remarks about the first two kinds of questions, the formulation question and the explanation question, and then I'll compare the rationalist view to some other theories of introspection that we can rely on to try to deal with this argument. So there is this question about how to formulate an introspection rule. Introspection rule says, if you're in a conscious state, then believe that you're in it. And what I would like to say about this is that that question is similar to parallel questions in other domains. So in the philosophy of rationality, for example, there's a similar question about all of the rational rules. So if we go back to these rules, there's a question in just the philosophy of rationality about what these rules really amount to. Is it the case, in the case of R1, for example, that a rational agent never has contradictory beliefs? Or is it that they never have contradictory beliefs under certain circumstances, when they're, for example, not too obviously contradictory, or something of that kind? This is a question that comes up always in these sorts of situations. And I think a lot of people think, well, there's something right about, let's say, the no contradiction rule, but precisely how to understand it is a difficult matter. Well, I want to say the same thing about a rule like R6. There's something right about it, but exactly how to formulate it will be a complicated matter. Going back to where we were, so notice then that on the formulation question, we can certainly ask that question about the introspection rule, but one thing to notice is that we can also ask analogous questions about all of the other rules of rationality. Likewise, there's an analogy here between this introspection rule and the kinds of things that will be advanced if you develop the broad perception model. The broad perception model that we've looked at, that Shoemaker criticizes, says that there are empirical laws or generalizations about when a person is in a conscious state and what beliefs that they will have as a consequence of that. So there might just be an empirical generalization that says that if you're in the conscious state, then believe that you're in it. In other words, there'll be an empirical generalization that looks exactly like R6, just going back to R6. R6 here comes up as a rule of rationality. But we could also read R6 as an empirical generalization. And if we did, we would end up with a version of the broad perceptual model. So in a certain sense, the rationalist view is, logically speaking, just like the broad perception model, except that it doesn't think that the rule in question is a rule of empirical psychology. It treats it instead as a rule of rationalist psychology. But the important thing is that if you're thinking of it as a rule either of empirical psychology or rationalist psychology, then there's going to be a question about how to formulate it. Like, for example, rules of empirical psychology are often rules that involve ceteris paribus clauses. The idea would be that if you're in a conscious state, then other things being equal, believe that you're in that state, or that you will believe that you're in that state, other things being equal. And we might think that the same thing would apply in the case of a rationalist rule. So all of these issues raise, so that the formulation question that I've broached here obviously raise a huge series of other questions. Now, how exactly to formulate it, how to compare the question about the introspection rule with other rational rules, and how to think about it in relation to other kinds of rules of psychology, perhaps empirical rules or empirical principles. But the point is that we have available to us a number of different ways of understanding the introspection rule, and so the formulation question, I think, is very much an open question here, something that we can think about. What about the explanation question? The explanation question is, well, however we formulate it, why do you think that this rule is a rule of rationality in the first place? Why think that? After all, I just assumed that it was and used that assumption to respond to the Dretscke argument, but I didn't say anything about why it's a rule of rationality. Well, in this case, I think we shouldn't expect a kind of knockdown argument. I don't think there is going to be a knockdown argument. Once again, in this sense, this is a sort of situation that's somewhat similar to these other rules of rationality. Whenever you propose a rule of rationality, it's going to be unclear exactly why it is a rule of rationality as opposed to others. What I want to do is to say that it's a sort of hypothesis that this is a rule of rationality that can be really judged by its fruits. And why is this hypothesis a plausible one? Well, we can think of certain lines of argument. Again, I'll just mention them without developing them too much. One is that having a rule of rationality like R6 in place is actually extremely consonant with what was intuitively thought of as the main sort of functional goal of theoretical rationality, namely to form true beliefs. If your goal, if rules of rationality are mainly judged by the extent to which they help you form true beliefs, well, then following R6 would be such a rule. It doesn't. It's certainly consonant with that kind of picture of rationality. So that might be one reason for thinking that it is a rule. I think also it's consonant with lots of ways of thinking about consciousness. In Lecture 1, I mentioned various different notions of consciousness. There's the higher order notion, there's the phenomenal notion, there's the access notion, and so forth. And I noted that it can't really be the higher order notion of consciousness that's at issue in introspection, because in effect the higher order notion of consciousness defines consciousness in terms of introspective belief rather than the other way around. But having said that, I think it would be wrong to say that there isn't something right in the impulse behind the higher order thought view. Many people have thought that there's some very deep connection between consciousness and having a belief about the state which is conscious. That's exactly what the higher order thought theory says. And if that's true, then R6 is a rule which somehow speaks to that intuition. The idea is that, at least in rational agents, when you're in a conscious state, you'll believe that you're in that state. The higher order thought theory says that happens whenever you're in a conscious state. I'm not sure that that's true, but I think it may well be true that it happens in rational agents, and if that's the case, we have a good reason for believing that R6 is true. And finally, I think R6 is made plausible because assuming this sort of picture gives us a lot of ways of solving certain puzzles about introspection that are otherwise really very difficult to solve. And the evidence argument that we've been looking at from Dretske is one example from that. We've seen that we can't solve it by appealing to perceptual models because those perceptual models are sort of off the table. But we can appeal to a rationalist model, and the rationalist model will allow us likewise to reject exactly the same premise that the perceptual models allow us to reject, but without falling into this, without falling into a perceptual model. But that raises, of course, the third of the three questions I distinguished before. I said there are these three questions that we could ask about the rationalist view: the formulation question, the explanation question, and the comparison question. And the comparison question is, how does the rationalist view compare with these other approaches to introspection and other ways to deal with the evidence argument? So that's what I want to do in the last part of our discussion, namely to look at some of these other theories and to see how they compare. And I'll look at three, namely the Constitutivist view, the Acquaintance view, and an Inferential view, some Inferential views. So first of all, the Constitutivist view of Shoemaker. The Constitutivist view of Shoemaker is a bit similar to the Rationalist view as I'm understanding it, but it's also importantly different. So what is the Constitutivist view? Well, what Shoemaker says is that there are two kind of guiding ideas to his own view. So you'll remember that Shoemaker criticizes the perceptual models, but he also proposes his own view, and his own view is this Constitutivist view, as it's called. And there's really two elements to this view. The first element is he wants to assert a certain kind of metaphysical necessity, a kind of metaphysically necessary truth, and the truth is that if you're in a conscious state, and if certain background conditions are met, and if you're rational, then that you'll believe that you're in the state. In fact, that is the thing that he appeals to also in his criticism of the broad perceptual model, namely the impossibility of self-blindness. That's what he calls this claim. Remember, the broad perceptual model, the problem with the broad perceptual model is that it doesn't accept this claim. It thinks of this as metaphysically contingent, not metaphysically necessary. And Shoemaker wants to say that this is a metaphysical necessity, and that's a crucial part of his entire view. The second part of his view is that the belief that you're in the conscious state, the belief that appears in this consequent of the conditional here, you're believing that you're in that state, that belief, he says, is just is a complex of the materials of the antecedent of the mentioned in the conditional in A. So basically he thinks that the belief that you're in the state just is a matter of being in the conscious state, meeting those background conditions, and being rational. What are the background conditions? They're the ones that we've been talking about all along. It means being capable of forming the belief, it's mattering to you whether the belief is true, and so forth. Shoemaker wants to say that if you're in the conscious state and those things are true and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. That's the first part of his view. And the second part of his view is that the belief that you're in the state just is that complex of materials. And the reason, that's actually why his theory is called a constitutivist theory. Constitutivism is a theory that the word constitutivism is used in many ways in philosophy, actually. But here the idea is that the belief that you're in a conscious state is constituted by these elements. And in fact, that's why this necessary truth is true in the first place. So those are the two views that Shoemaker holds. And if you hold those views, then you again have a reason to reject premise one of the Dretscke argument. And the reason is that if they're both true, then being in a conscious state provides you with a warrant, as Shoemaker says, to believe that you're in the state. So the idea is that, and you could have that warrant even if you had no evidence in the sense of P2. That's the proposal. So the proposal is that we've got this necessity. It's metaphysically necessary that if you're in a conscious state and these conditions obtain and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. And secondly, that the belief that you're in the state just is those complex of features. And all of this amounts to a proposal that says that you can deny premise one once again. Okay. Well, how do we contrast the rationalist view and the constitutivist view? Well, both of them accept the first claim that Shoemaker is interested in, this metaphysical necessity. Both agree with this, actually. Shoemaker obviously agrees with this, and the rationalist view likewise agrees with it. It says that if you're in a conscious state, certain background conditions are met, and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. This is in fact why the rationalist view is not a version of the broad perceptual view. The broad perceptual view denies this claim. That's in fact the reason for Shoemaker rejecting the broad perceptual view. But the rationalist view accepts it, just like Shoemaker's view. So on this score, there's no difference between the Shoemaker view and the rationalist view. But the Shoemaker view and the rationalist view are going to give very different explanations of this claim. The rationalist view will give an explanation for it in terms of the content of rationality. So it will say that in the condition that's mentioned here, namely that you are rational, that will be a matter of abiding by the introspection rule. You abide by the introspection rule. And that's why it'll be metaphysically necessary that if you're in a conscious state and these background conditions are met, and you're rational, that means you abide by the rule, then you'll believe that you're in the state. That will be the explanation for why that's true. But Shoemaker doesn't say that. He doesn't explain this claim in terms of saying something about what the rules of rationality are. What he says is that what explains it is that the belief that you're in the state is just a matter of being in these antecedent conditions. That's the reason. And so he actually doesn't think of being rational as involving this introspection rule. He doesn't ever say anything like that. You might put it this way: he doesn't appeal to anything about the content of rationality to explain this truth, if it's true. He only appeals to the property of being rational. A person is rational in certain ways. So one difference then between the rationalist view and the constitutivist view, or the constitutive view, is that while they both agree with this initial claim, they give different accounts of why it's true. But the second difference is that the constitutivist part of the constitutivist view, namely B, that was just to go back, B, the belief that you're in a conscious state just is the complex of the materials in the antecedent of that conditional, that is an implausible thing to say. It seems to be implausible to say that the second order belief that you're in the conscious state just is that complex of conditions. For one thing, you could be in that state and not be in that complex of conditions. A point that Shoemaker accepts, I think. But he goes on to say that, in this particular instance, the belief is identical. But I worry that now that the topic has been changed, because we're no longer talking about that kind of belief. We're only talking about that particular instance. But in any case, it seems implausible to say that the second order belief just is the complex of conditions. And moreover, if you say that it is, then it's clear that the notion of rationality that Shoemaker is talking about must be thought of as a somewhat thin notion. And in fact, this point comes out in Byrne's discussion. Byrne, as we noted last time, has this interesting distinction between an economical approach and an extravagant approach. And the economical approach is one that uses materials that are sort of there anyway, and the extravagant approach is one which goes beyond those materials. I think Byrne would say about the rule R6 that I've been talking about, that it's extravagant to suppose that that's a rule of rationality. But in any case, he does say that Shoemaker's own view is economical, and it's economical because it uses notions of rationality that are there anyway. So in other words, it uses rules like, if we go back actually to the picture I mentioned before about the rationalist view, I think Shoemaker has in mind by rationality rules pretty much like R1 and R2. Unclear to me if he means even R3, R4, R5, but certainly he means something that doesn't involve R6 in the sense that I've been talking about. So now if you go back to Shoemaker's view, that means that rationality must be thin in the sense that it doesn't include R6. But you know, if you understand rationality in that way, it's a little bit unclear why the first part of his view should be true at all. So if we go back again, the first part of his view is this: it's metaphysically necessary that if you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions are met and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. Well, what is meant by you are rational? If it means something like you avoid contradictory beliefs, or you engage in means-ends reasoning, and that's all that's meant, then it's an open question as to why that is true. Why is it true that it's metaphysically necessary that if you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions are met, then you'll believe that you're in that state? If the rational rules that are involved in being rational don't mention anything about forming beliefs of that kind, it doesn't seem as if it's plausible at all to say that this is a metaphysically necessary truth. So I'm sorry, I've just gone ahead. So I think there's an issue here about how to understand the notion of rationality that Shoemaker is appealing to in a way that would make sense of his broader constitutivist view. There's another issue here, which is why the second-order belief that he's appealing to should be justified in the first place. He says that it is. He says that you're warranted. The belief that you form in that case would be warranted. But it's a bit unclear to me why that is true. The mere fact that it's metaphysically necessary, that if you're in a conscious state and these background conditions are met and you're rational, if that were true, that it's metaphysically necessary that you'll form the belief, it doesn't follow from that the belief will be justified. That's different from the rationalist view that treats that belief as the manifestation of a rational process. But that isn't true on Shoemaker's own view. So it's a bit unclear why Shoemaker's view is an advantage over the rationalist view here, even though, of course, one should say that the views are quite similar. They're similar insofar as they emphasize rationality. They're similar insofar as they attack the same premise of this Dretscke argument. But when you look in detail at the Shoemaker view, it looks as if it's quite a different sort of view, and in fact a somewhat implausible one. Well, what about an acquaintance view? How might an acquaintance view deal with the evidence argument or the Dretscke argument? Well, what is an acquaintance view? Well, an acquaintance view says that, well, there are really three guiding ideas of the acquaintance view. The first idea is that you're in a conscious state just if and only if you're acquainted with being in that state, or we might say acquainted with the fact that you're in that state. So you're in pain, for example, if and only if you're acquainted with being in pain. And the second, so that's one big idea, that consciousness and acquaintance go together. The second idea is that you're acquainted with the fact that you're in the conscious state. If you're acquainted with that fact, then you're propositionally justified to believe that you're in the state, whether or not you do. So the idea is that whatever acquaintance is, it's something which is when you're acquainted with something, immediately a certain kind of epistemic fact comes into being, namely you're justified to believe something, regardless of whether you do. And the third element of the acquaintance view is something like this, that suppose you form the belief that you're in the conscious state on the basis of this acquaintance, then the belief will be justified and typically amount to knowledge, at least in the normal case. So there's really three elements of the view. One says conscious states and acquaintance necessarily go together. The second says that acquaintance gives you a certain kind of justification to believe things, regardless of whether you do. And the third says that if you form these beliefs on the basis of the acquaintance, then those beliefs will be justified and will amount to knowledge. Well, once again, the acquaintance view gives us the materials to deny P1. Here the idea is, well, suppose you're in a conscious state. Suppose you are seeing a cat and you're consciously seeing a cat. Well, on the acquaintance view, it must be that you're acquainted with the fact that you're in this state. And hence, it's rational for you to believe that you're in the state, whether or not you do. That's because acquaintance gives you a certain kind of propositional justification. And then if you did come to believe that, or if you did come to know it, then you could know it. Sorry, if you did come to believe that, then your belief would amount to knowledge. But you wouldn't have evidence. For the thing that you know, for the claim that you're seeing a cat, in the sense of P2. It's not the case that there's some proposition you're aware of which supports this claim. It's rather that you're in a certain state and are acquainted with the state. Well, what's to say about what can we say about the contrast between the rationalist view and the acquaintance view? Well, I think the acquaintance view has a number of implausible consequences when compared with the rationalist view, and I'll just mention these. Some of these problems will come out much later, I think, in our discussion. But let me mention some of them. One is that it rules out a certain kind of introspective error. I'll look at this problem in the last couple of lectures. The problem is that on the acquaintance view, if you are justified in the introspective way, in believing something, then your belief must be true, because consciousness and acquaintance always go together necessarily. And that seems kind of odd. You might think, well, why can't we have a case of introspectively justified belief that isn't true? Likewise, I think the acquaintance view has sort of trouble with very simple creatures. The notion of consciousness that we're interested in here is something that can be in place for very, very simple creatures that aren't intuitively rational creatures, for example. And on the rationalist view, that is explained by the fact that you only are in a position to form a justified belief about your own conscious states if you abide by the rule. The mere fact that you're conscious or that you're in conscious states doesn't put you in any position of that sort. But the acquaintance view, because it treats consciousness and acquaintance as necessarily connected together, it'll have the consequence that whenever you have consciousness, you have this epistemic fact that someone is in a position epistemically to form a certain belief. And that seems very strange because it seems odd to, for example, say of a creature that couldn't even form the belief that it's justified in forming that belief. It sort of seems to violate a kind of what you might think of as an ought implies can sort of point. The third problem with the acquaintance view is that it raises the issue of just what acquaintance is in the first place. What sort of relation is it that you bear to a conscious state? Acquaintance can't just mean the notion of instantiation. Of course, you might say that when you have a conscious state or when you're in a conscious state, you are instantiated. But acquaintance isn't just the instantiation relation. It's supposed to be a special kind of relation that comes along with being in the conscious state. And it's just a little bit unclear what that is. Notice that the rationalist view avoids this problem completely because it doesn't propose any kind of acquaintance. And finally, I think the acquaintance view raises regress issues because acquaintance isn't supposed to be identical with consciousness. It's supposed to be something that's necessarily connected to consciousness. But since it too will be a conscious state, presumably, if you're acquainted with a certain thing, then that itself is a state, that itself will be a conscious state, in which case we look as if we have a kind of regress. So there's a range of different problems with the acquaintance view that make the rationalist view look more plausible. So let me just summarize where we are. I've been looking throughout this lecture at this argument that we took from Dretske, and the premises of this argument again are that if I know that I'm seeing a cat, I have evidence for what I know. If I have evidence for what I know, there's a proposition which meets these conditions, namely A, I'm aware of that proposition, and B, it supports or confirms what I know. And premise 3, in cases distinctive of introspection, there's no such proposition. And all of the theories that we've been looking at target premise 1 of this argument. They all say that there's something wrong with premise 1. So they all, in fact, invoke something analogous to Byrne's glaring flaw in this, in the analogous argument about perception that isn't about introspection. So the perceptual views obviously target premise 1. They say you can know that you're seeing a cat by being object aware in the object perception version of seeing a cat. The rationalist view also targets premise 1. It says that you can know that you're seeing a cat and not have evidence in the relevant sense. Shoemaker's constitutive view is the same, and the acquaintance view is the same as well. But let me finally note that there are also inferentialist theories that would reject a different premise of the argument. They would reject premise 3. They'd say, look, in cases of introspection, even in cases distinctive of introspection, it's not true that there's no such proposition of the kind mentioned in premise 2. There is. It's just that we overlook it because it's not a proposition of the normal sort. Well, what can we say about these sorts of views? Well, the first thing to say is that there are really two kinds of inferential theory, really two kinds of different sort of theory. The first says that despite appearances, I would infer that I'm seeing a cat, so I infer that I'm seeing a cat from something. But the thing that I infer it from is another aspect of my psychology. So we might say that despite appearances, I infer that I'm seeing a cat from another psychological premise. For example, that it seems to me that I'm seeing a cat, or that it feels to me that I'm seeing a cat, or that I have a certain sensation perhaps. And I infer that I'm seeing a cat on the basis of this psychological premise. That would be one kind of inferential theory. The other kind of inferential theory says that despite appearances, I infer that I'm seeing a cat from a non-psychological premise, say a premise about my behavior or my surroundings or something of that sort. Now, the first kind of inferential theory, the kind that says that I infer that I'm seeing a cat from another psychological premise, that kind has actually been defended recently by Kasim Kassam as one person who's written a lot of interesting work on self-knowledge, and by Peter Carruthers as well. They both say that at least in certain cases, I come to know that I believe or see certain things on the basis of other psychological premises. But the problem with these sorts of theories is that they tend to presuppose introspective knowledge, because I'd need to know these other psychological premises in order to infer claims like I'm seeing a cat or that I believe such and such. Actually, in Carruthers' case, the view is at any rate limited to knowledge of belief, not to knowledge of perception. And so while you could say about these inferential theory, this kind of inferential theory, that there might be some truth in it, it can't really be an alternative to the other views. It needs to be premised on some non-inferential view, for example, something like the rationalist view that I've been defending. The second kind of inferential theory is widely rejected, and that's because the second kind says that I come to know that I'm seeing a cat on the basis of some premise about my behavior, let's say, or my local circumstances. And that's normally been ruled out, mainly because in its usual form it just isn't true that I have come to know that I'm seeing a cat on the basis of that sort of information. Though Alex Byrne, who we've mentioned a number of times, defends a view of this kind in his book in a kind of unusual form. He doesn't think that you come to know that you're seeing a cat on the basis of behavioural premises, but rather on a different kind of thing. But in order to examine that idea, we need to look first at Gareth Evans's views about transparency, as he calls it, which are in some ways like Dretske's views, but in other ways are quite different. At any rate, that's going to be the topic of the lecture next time. So I will see you all then. Thanks very much.